people are often wont to do when they're desperate, they go to church and pray. So there was a businessman who was millions of dollars in debt and experiencing a lot of cash flow problems, and so he decided, okay, I better go to church and pray. So he knelt in one of the pews there and began to pray that he would have his debts resolved in some capacity. Well, there was a gentleman who was also in need of prayer who knelt beside him, and he was almost praying out loud because he needed $100 in order for his debt to be repaid. And so the businessman went to his wallet, took out a $100 bill and gave it to him. And the man was overjoyed, so he left the church. And the businessman, who was millions of dollars in debt, began to pray to God, saying, okay, Lord, now that the distraction is gone, listen to my prayer of debt. So just trying to be focused on overcoming his debt problem, of being focused. And I think ultimately to realize, that when we're in debt, it's not a good feeling. And so then we have to pay out. But we're, for us as Christians, owed to no one anything except to love one another. Now, for the past 10 Sundays, our second reading has been taken from Paul's letter to the Romans, which is really the pinnacle of Pauline theology. It's the longest of Paul's letters, but the most thorough. Now, St. Paul wrote that letter in about the year 56 in a place in Greece called Corinth, in which he also wrote a letter to the Corinthian community 2 times during his lifetime. And Paul's intent was to then go from Corinth to Jerusalem to give some money to the poor there, and then to end up going to Spain via Rome, because he was so fruitful in his public ministry in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. He wanted to go out west to spread the good news. And so he's preparing the people in Rome that he was going to come. And often when Paul was writing, or even the very fact we have gospel, is because there was a problem. And the problem in Rome was that, one, the persecutions were very prominent, and also having to deal with people who didn't believe in Jesus, namely the Jewish people. So Paul's letter is really saying to the people in Rome, is essentially saying, hey, remember, it's not what we do for God, but what God does for us. And Paul would say it succinctly, we are justified by faith. That it is God's gratuitous gift upon us that transforms us to make us one with Him, to truly become adopted brothers and sisters of Christ. It's not what we do in terms of the law, like, okay, Lord, I'm going to do all these sacrifices, I'm saying all these prayers, and I'll be okay. No, Paul's saying we're transformed by His grace. And then we're so transformed that comes out in how we love one another. And so Paul's letter to the Romans, a big part of it is how Jesus transforms us by His grace. He also alludes to the dimension of the Jewish people. How can they have not accepted Jesus? And then lastly, this is now the 13th chapter which we've read today. It's a section called the duties of the Christian. And so Paul says, as beginning today's second reading, owe to no one nothing or anything except to love one another. Well, what does it mean to owe? So for Paul, as I mentioned, we're so transformed by grace that we become truly a child of God. And Paul is really saying, hey, now that God has transformed us, He's given us His gift of grace, we have to do something with it. We owe Him something now because of this encounter in faith. Now that word owe is also what St. Luke uses when he gives his version of the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us. So very much in that sense, if we have been forgiven by God, we receive His grace, as Jesus teaches us in the Lord's Prayer. So too we must owe that debt of forgiveness to others. Okay, so we owe something, and we're supposed to love one another. Well, what does love mean? Now, the New Testament was written in Greek, and so even the words that they use for love are a little bit different than the one word we use for love. Now, when we talk about love, we say, oh, I love my parents, I love ice cream, I love coffee, I love my country. So what does this mean we're supposed to love one another? In Greek, they have about 4 words for the word love, so it's very much nuanced. So the first kind of love that the Greeks would use is called storge, which children have for their parents. A kind of mutual respect. I love my parents and I honor them. But that's not the word that St. Paul uses in today's second reading. Another word many of us are familiar with is eros, erotic love, passionate love. We see something attractive, we almost love it, we're drawn to it. Now, is that the kind of love that Paul refers to in today's second reading? No. So it's not storge, it's not eros, erotic love. There's another word that's very common among the Greeks, and they would consider them for themselves the highest form of love, philia. The nickname for the city of Philadelphia is a city of brotherly love. So Adelphi means brother or sister, and philia means love. So it's like the love we have for those who are closest to us, like our friends and family. And we have a great respect. We like being with them. So is that the word that St. Paul uses for love? No, there's another word. And it's really the Christian form of love. The word that St. Paul uses in today's second reading is called agape. Agape means to love for the other's sake without receiving anything in return. And that's really the love that we should have not only for one another, but even for our enemies. That's where Jesus uses agape. Because how can we love our enemies if we're not friends with them, if we don't love them like our brothers and sisters? So agape. So owe one another nothing except to love one another. So we're supposed to have this agape love. For St. Paul, one is so transformed by grace that it is now this duty, a debt, that we have to love one another. And the perfect model of that agape love is Jesus on the cross. He gives himself totally for the world. He doesn't receive anything in return. He's there to take away the sins of the world. And so, as we heard a couple Sundays ago about Jesus said, unless you want to be my follower, take up your cross and follow me. It is to have that kind of agape love. To love for the other's sake without receiving anything in return. And it's the highest form of love, and it's the costliest form of love. Because even St. Paul in the letter to the Romans says, it's nice for a good person to die for another good person. And for someone to have to suffer or die for someone who's bad, that's difficult. And so this idea of love is this call to really lay down one's life when it's not easy, when it's difficult. And so there are a number of examples that are kind of littered throughout our readings today about how we're supposed to love. And I'm sure if I were to pose the question, who in your life needs to be loved? Who do you owe that love to? And I'm sure we can go down the list of people that we're supposed to love, but there's some kind of a grievance, or it's just difficult to love. So how are we supposed to love? Agape love. Well, St. Paul says, okay, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't covet. Okay, we have that. Think what Jesus says in today's gospel about correcting people. If someone syndicates you, okay, Jesus says, go to him or her directly. If not, take 2 or 3 witnesses. If not, bring him or her to the church. And if not, cast him. But this idea of fraternal correction, of saying to people, hey, that's not right. Especially of another Catholic. By virtue of our faith, which is represented in baptism, we are called to not only the privilege of being a child of God, but also responsibility that comes along with it. So they have to correct someone and say, hey, that's not right. That's part of the call to love. And I think another call to love is also, we can overlook the people who are closest to us and not be filled with gratitude of the people that we have around us. We can almost treat them worse off than we treat our own friends and or maybe our colleagues at work. So, we need to be mindful, hey, of the blessings we have among the people around us. So I like to correct people in terms of the call to love, but even to show gratitude. And that might, another form of it could be in forgiveness of someone who's maybe has sinned against us, and a way to owe the gratitude of love is to forgive them. Another way that we can show our love is to share time, talent, and treasure. I mean, once we realize that everything comes from God, God is ultimately going to judge each one of us. How have you used the gifts I've given you to love one another and to love me? And so it's always that call, okay, Lord, am I sharing my time, talent, and treasure with others? So we realize we are indebted, and we are, in fact, the luckiest people in the face of the earth because of, okay, one thing, living in Alberta, a very prosperous area, but more importantly, the gift of faith. And the Lord is going to say to us, hey, you've been transformed, you are freed from sin and slavery, you are a new creation. Okay, make the world new by this gift you have. And so each one of us is going to be tasked, how have you loved me? And that's a debt we owe to one another. And agape love, we cannot give what we don't have. And so that's why our whole lives are built upon what Jesus has done for us. And he gives us his word to inspire us. He gives us his food to nourish us. to then be instruments of love in the world, because we are indebted. And at the end of the Mass, like I would say, let's go in peace, glorifying the Lord through our lives. Well, it's to use the gifts that the Lord has given us, this gift of grace and renewal, to bring grace and renewal to the world. And so let's pray this week like that businessman who was indebted millions of dollars. He wanted God's undivided attention so that his debt could be somehow overlooked or forgiven, or given the money to pay his debts. And this week, let's remember how indebted we are to God for what He has given us. And in turn, let us show how grateful we are for that debt of His gift of grace by loving one another.